I'm Francis Durnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we monitor further Ukrainian advances across the front lines, assess the highest level trip by a US official to China since 2018, and speak again to the CEO of the Halo Trust about clearing landmines and the upcoming Ukraine Recovery Conference.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
We need a military strategy for Ukraine to gain a decisive advantage on the battlefield, to win the war.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 19th of June, 1 year and 115 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, our usual host of the podcast, David Knowles, on the ground in Ukraine, and former Major General James Cowan from the Halo Trust. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from the battlefield.
So, overnight, 4 Caliber cruise missiles, 4 Shahed drones fired at Ukraine, all shot down according to the Ukraine Air Force. Other than that, it looks like there have been small advances across all sectors of this front. Now, we've got to kind of decide what we're going to call it. Phillips O'Brien from the University of St Andrews is calling the area between the kind of bend in the Dnipro River along to Donetsk the central front, which seems about reasonable if you talk about Kherson being south and then sort of Bakhmut north being the east. So for easy shorthand, I'm going to refer to that as the central front from now on, which includes sort of going, at the moment, Ukraine have been trying to push directly south from Zaporizhia, that area, sort of southeast through the Volodar area, and then east also through Bakhmut. So that other bit sort of heading south as if they are, as we would expect, trying to cut the land bridge that Russia has established. That is what Phillips O'Brien is referring to as the central front. So if you hear me say that, that's where I mean. They have been making small gains at cost across all sectors. Now, the town of Piatihakhti, which is to the west of that line, and thank you, Alyona, for the pronunciation there. So about 30 km south of Zaporizhia, right on that bend, the elbow in the Dnipro River. That's where that town is. That was taken yesterday. Now, across sectors, they are making small, steady gains. We're talking kilometres rather than anything more substantial. I still think this is effectively a raid in force, reckoning in strength, looking for the dispositions of the Russian forces, getting them to commit their reserves, looking for Russia to commit things like aviation. So we've seen an uptick in Russian air activity and helicopter activity. Air generally refers to sort of fixed-wing fighter jets. Aviation tends to refer to helicopters. But we've seen an uptick in both of those. Ka-52 attack helicopters more in action and more shot down, 2 shot down over the weekend. So, you never want one of those things in your backyard, but actually the fact that they are having to be committed by Russia, it shows where they feel under pressure. So that's happening across the front. Now, today's UK Defence Intelligence report confirms news from last week that over the last 10 days, Russia started moving forces out, relocating elements from what they term the Dnipro group of forces from the eastern bank of the Dnipro River, so the area that was flooded when the dam was destroyed a couple of weeks ago. Russian forces in that area have been thinned out, and they are reinforcing the Zaporizhia and Bakhmut sectors. That's said to involve several thousand troops from Russia's 49th Army, including the 34th Separate Motorized Brigade, as well as airborne forces, the VDV, which should be better trained, equipped and led, although quite what state they're in after nearly a year and a half of fighting, we don't think they're anything like their normal strength, and other naval infantry units as well. That is interesting. I mean, when you start moving around big formations like that, it takes time, obviously. It takes a lot of coordination, and it's very obvious. It's very obvious visually. You'll be able to see it. You'll be able to see it from space. You should be able to see it with the drones and whatever that they've got up. You'll also be able to see it electromagnetically. You'll see a spike in the radio traffic, so you'll know that something's moving somewhere. So all that adds friction, adds fog. But until those forces are in position, then it's almost as much of a liability. The movement, the actual physical movement of forces, is as much a liability to the force doing the moving as it then will eventually be to the opposing side. So this is an opportunity there for Russia, obviously, to strengthen certain areas where it wants to, but it is in and of itself very vulnerable whilst it's on the move. It obviously has to protect itself. You'd expect it to have flank cover and overhead cover as well, but if a lot of the effort and the horsepower, the intellectual horsepower is done on actually moving you in good order across hundreds of kilometers, then there's less horsepower to actually think about defending yourself and fighting the enemy. So they are vulnerable is all I'm saying, but they seem to be on the move at the moment. It's led to increased speculation that with the much reduced water levels above the dam, Ukraine could look to get away over what's left of the waterway there. So there's nearly 200 kilometers of the Dnipro River between where the dam was and sort of go back east and north between the dam and the front lines just south of Zaporizhia. About 200 k's there, that front. So if Russia's thinning that out, there's an opportunity. Now that's boggy and marshy, and it used to have a big reservoir sat on top of it. But that will increasingly, the earth there will increasingly be baked in the summer sun. Very unlikely it would be able to support heavy armor like tanks and what have you, but might support lighter vehicles. And it is unlikely that Ukraine, with the proven ability to innovate and the proven desire to spook the Russians every opportunity, unlikely they won't try something. It's a very inviting and less well-defended flank, so we'll keep an eye on that. Now, elsewhere over the weekend, a number of Russian ammunition dumps in Kherson Oblast went up in flames. So going sort of west to east from the Black Sea coast, sort of in line due south of the delta of the Dnipro River, so where the river empties out into the Black Sea, come south of there. So from there, a line going east. You've got the areas of Luzern, and just to the east of that, Skadovsk, and they're about 40 k's south of the delta. And then further to the east, just above Crimea, Rykove, and a little further east, Henichensk. And those last two are about 120 k's behind the line. So a big line there of major ammunition dumps that all went up in smoke over the weekend. Similar to last summer, July, August last year, when a number of such places were being destroyed. That was then put down last year to HIMARS strikes, long-range precision artillery. That caused Russia to move these things out of range of HIMARS and get them even further away. So we saw a lull over winter and spring when they were not in range. Ukraine couldn't get to them. We think these ones that are being hit now are probably Storm Shadow missiles, cruise missiles, British supplied, or other similar long-range cruise missiles that we've not really heard about yet. There's speculation that Storm Shadow is not the only thing that can get that far, but they're now back in range, so that will have an effect on the battlefield. Now, elsewhere, Colonel Margo Grosberg, who is Estonia's Defence Forces intelligence chief, he said that the Ukrainian army has lost less than 10% of the Western equipment it was gifted so far. He was speaking to Estonian news outlet ARR, and he said he highlighted the superior protection of the Western equipment, which means that more people are surviving to fight again. As we said last week, if you can regenerate them and regenerate the equipment, then you still have your capability. And on the counter-offensive, he said that the vast majority of the recently trained Ukrainian units have not yet participated, which adds to this idea that Ukraine is still doing recce and force, just looking for the gaps, looking to invite Russia to expose where the forces are and where their EW is and where their guns are sighted and so on and so forth. So I think they're still doing that before we've not yet seen any real deployment of these. We think they've got 12 new brigades, of which 9 we think are built around Western equipment. So Colonel Grosberg also said that they're not expecting any swift offensive by Ukraine in the near future. They still think, albeit it's happening at some significant size and it's incredibly violent and there are casualties on both sides, and lots of casualties on both sides, it's not yet the major offensive. Just one final one. A report out last Thursday came from the UN. I've been very critical of the UN, as you know, but I'm very happy to highlight where I think they're getting it right. So they put a report out on Thursday. They're saying widespread use of torture by Russian military in Ukraine appears deliberate. So this was a report out from the team of the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Alice Edwards, and the report expressed alarm at testimonies that appear to indicate that Russian military forces in Ukraine are consistently and intentionally inflicting severe physical and psychological pain and suffering on civilians and prisoners of war. So the team sent a letter to Russian authorities, jointly signed by Ms. Edwards and other independent UN experts, saying that torture is allegedly being carried out to extract intelligence or force confessions, or because people have shown, either through what they say or tattoos and what have you, former membership or support for Ukrainian armed forces. So the text of the report says the alleged practices include electric shocks, beatings, hooding, mock executions, and other threats of death. If established, they would constitute individual violations and may also amount to a pattern of state-endorsed torture or other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. The UN team said the consistency and methods of the alleged torture suggest a level of coordination, planning, and organisation, as well as the direct authorisation and deliberate policy of official tolerance from superior authorities. So I think it's a pretty strong report. No indication yet that Russian authorities have responded to the letter. And I said I'm not shy at all to say, well, I think the UN are getting it right. So that's out there. You'll be able to find it on their website. And I hope that will be used to build a case for any future actions through the ICC.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. There's been no shortage of political developments either. I'll come to the fallout from the African leaders' visits to Kyiv and Moscow in a moment. But the big diplomatic story of this morning is the US Secretary of State's visit to China, which began over the weekend. Now, we've not been expecting any breakthroughs as such, but it is significant that in the past couple of hours or so, President Xi did meet with Mr. Blinken to cap off the meeting, something we were not sure would take place. He is, of course, the highest-ranking US official to meet with President Xi since 2018. Now, President Xi has released a statement, which I'll read now. The Chinese side has made our position clear, and the two sides have agreed to follow through on the common understanding that President Biden and I had reached in Bali. They're referring, of course, to the pairs meeting at the G20 summit last November. The two sides have also made progress and reached agreement on some specific issues. This is very good. Now, I don't need to remind listeners as to the numerous issues the two countries are in disagreement over. It's not just Russia's encroachment in Ukraine, but China's assertion of territorial rights over the self-governing island of Taiwan and its establishment of military bases in the South China Sea. The rhetoric between the two powers has been heated, to say the least. The last visit was cancelled when a Chinese spy balloon was shot down over the US, which I'm sure listeners will recall. So why now? Well, the motivations from a Western standpoint are obvious in relation to Ukraine, at least, to deter Xi from propping up Putin. In exchange, one assumes, for commitments not to cut China off from certain economic agreements. Many argue this should have been happening right at the start of the war, in that crucial window when the shock was raw. The current state of China's economy, though, is particularly unfavourable, despite optimistic expectations following 3 years of zero COVID. That policy designed, of course, to try and stop COVID spreading at all around the country. The recovery has fallen short of Beijing's aspirations. Western demand is down as businesses become increasingly wary of China's economic fragility, and manufacturing output remains low. Inflation is also high, with the People's Bank of China recently opting to lower rates in an attempt to stimulate the economy. I expect we'll hear more from the summit over the coming days, so more on that as we get it. The other major diplomatic development is, of course, the African peace mission to Ukraine and Russia that we reported on as they arrived in Kyiv on Friday. After their visit, which involved a meeting with President Zelensky, they went onwards to Moscow, where they met with Putin. I won't repeat the context I gave on Friday for the visit, only to say that African nations do have a major stake in this war, not least because of the impact of it on global food prices. Indeed, after visiting both countries. The South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, listed his 10 principles for ending the war, which included unimpeded grain exports, surprise, surprise, as well as de-escalation, the recognition of countries' sovereignty as laid out in the UN Charter, security guarantees for all countries, and sending POWs and children back to their countries of origin. Now, my own take on the list is that there are more veiled rebukes in there of the Russian position than of the Ukrainian, especially in the context of referencing the Charter and children. Indeed, the Kremlin deemed them very difficult to implement almost as immediately as they were announced. President Zelensky, it has to be said, has also reiterated this morning that no peace can be agreed until Russia leaves their territory. But I sense a slight more sort of softness towards the African position than perhaps coming out of the Kremlin. Let's face it, all these summits, though, are of negligible influence until something profound changes in either the military or political spheres, as I've said before. But they do reveal the world is growing anxious at the duration of this war, which could favour either side, depending on which bloc countries align themselves with. And I sense that Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary of NATO, agrees. He's gone so far as to warn yesterday against premature peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, suggesting that it would leave Zelensky's troops vulnerable to a decision dictated by Moscow. I'll quote from him. He was speaking in the German newspaper Welt on Sunday. "We all want this war to end, but for peace to be sustainable, it must be just. Peace cannot mean freezing the conflict and accepting a deal dictated by Russia. Only Ukraine alone can define the acceptable conditions for peace. We need to make sure that when this war ends, there are credible agreements for Ukraine's security so that Russia cannot rearm and attack again, and the cycle of Russian aggression is broken." And I think what's interesting about that perspective is that's very, very much the Kyiv line on this. There's no deviation whatsoever from Kyiv's position with regard to what peace looks like in this war. Now, finally, whilst we're on the subject of big international bodies, the UN has said that Russia has declined the organisation's request to access Russian-controlled areas of Ukraine which have been affected by flooding following the breach of the Kakhovka Dam in order to deliver aid. So Denise Brown, the UN's humanitarian coordinator for Ukraine, has said in a statement, "The UN has been engaging with the governments of Ukraine and the Russian Federation regarding effective delivery of humanitarian aid to all people affected by the devastating destruction of the dam. The government of the Russian Federation has so far declined our request to access the areas under its temporary military control. The UN will continue to engage to seek necessary access. We urge the Russian authorities to act in accordance with their obligations under international humanitarian law. Aid cannot be denied to people who need it. The UN will continue to do all it can to reach people, including those suffering as a result of the recent dam destruction, who urgently need life-saving assistance no matter where they are." Does this statement come as a surprise? Does the Russian denial come as a surprise? No, but it will further concern, I think, of those who are anxious about extended access to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is why, of course, having a country like China involved in renewed discussions with the West may be significant as a way around this, but we shall see. Anyway, so that's where we are internationally. I have some more updates on Russia later. But first, let's catch up now with David Knowles on his journey across Ukraine. David, this is London Calling. I understand you've been all over the country since we left you on Friday. So where did you go after we left you then?
Hi, Francis. Hi, everyone. Well, I'm calling you now from Taras Shevchenko Park in the centre of Kyiv. To my right is the monument to Taras Shevchenko. If you remember, he is one of the great, if not the great, Ukrainian poet, artist, writer. That monument is still covered in sort of protective cladding. There are families walking around me. There's a small child with a football and a girl waving with a small German flag, funnily enough. Ahead of me, there's an open cafe. I can see an old woman with presumably one of her grandchildren rocking them gently to sleep in a pushchair. There's a fountain and a beautiful sort of yellow classical building to my left. And one of the points of invincibility, one of the yurts of invincibility as well, is actually in this park. I sort of raced to be here because it's cooler. Kyiv is very hot today. And I'm in the shade under the trees. So I haven't actually put my head in the yurt yet. But it's a very peaceful summer scene here. As far as I know, I just checked the app and actually there's no As far as I can see at the moment, there's no air alert over Ukraine, so hopefully this report will go uninterrupted. But yeah, it's been a big few days, a lot of travel. I'll come back to Kyiv maybe later, or maybe another day actually, because there's still a few details I think to be ironed out there. There's some interesting things happened. But yesterday, on Friday was in Kyiv, and on Saturday drove with the volunteers, accompanied the volunteers down to Kharkiv. It's a long drive over the high steppe, lots of forest, lots of farmland, very, very green, the middle of summer. And as you get closer to the front line, closer to the Russian border, you do see more military vehicles. There are a few checkpoints. And we came into Kharkiv, an absolutely beautiful city. I mean, it's so sad to see what's happened to it. We were the hotel owner, on discovering that the volunteers were British, insisted on coming out and giving a little tour of the centre of the city. We looked around, and almost every single building was damaged. There's a lot of boarded up shops, a lot of boarded up restaurants, a lot of there are people out, but we're told that a lot of people have left the city. It's not very far from the Russian border, and it was incredibly sad to see. Really, it's we saw the university building is still absolutely gutted. Most of the houses, quite a few of the churches as well. Actually, you can see on the golden domes, the sort of plating of the towers has been chipped and destroyed by some of the missiles and drones fired at Kharkiv. So that was Kharkiv, and then we left fairly early in the morning. The group of volunteers I was travelling with, we went down to Kramatorsk, obviously very, very close to Bakhmut, to that area where one of the axes of the Ukrainian counteroffensive is taking place. You're traveling, when you're going to Kramatorsk, you're going through a lot of the areas that have been heavily contested over the past year, and going through many of the areas that were Russian controlled and have now been liberated by the Ukrainian armed forces. So really, the closer you get, the more astonishing the damage. We drove through several villages where not a single house was unscarred. Most had lost their roofs. I think we went through one village and you didn't see a single window pane still present, and very few people in a few of them as well. You also see quite a few. Going through the rest of the country has been notable in that a lot of the Russian sort of discarded or destroyed Russian armor has been cleared up and moved elsewhere. In the edge of Kharkiv region, Kharkiv Oblast, and into Donetsk, quite a lot of it is still just by the side of the road. So we saw several. We saw a tank that had its turret blown off, which had clearly been hit by something and it sort of trundled to the side of the road and trundled off the road. That was at the point, actually, we were in between two minefields going towards Kramatorsk. And, the checkpoints there, we've noticed around the rest of the country, some of the soldiers you see, I wouldn't say they're exactly friendly. They are professional, they have a job to do, but they see you, they nod and they wave you on. And usually an explanation of, it's aid to the front line gets you through, and not at all when you're actually getting near the front. These guys are take it incredibly seriously. And I think once I'd shown my press pass, we got stopped about 4 or 5 times, 4 or 5 checkpoints to get into Kramatorsk. And it's not just the villages. There's a distinct lack of people in some of these places, and you can see these vast sort of factories and pieces of industry which have also been hit and gutted and totally destroyed. There's one. I think this is as we were going through Izium. There was an apartment building which I think the picture is quite famous. So I can't quite place when it happened in my head, but half of the apartment, the sort of middle section of the apartment building has been completely destroyed. So you see a load of apartments on one side, then just a space, and then the rest of the apartments on the other side. But it used to be one building. So this is an area where Russian artillery did its absolute worst and was heavily fought over the past year and a half. We got into Kramatorsk, another completely beautiful town. Broad boulevards, the flowers are open, and the sort of people are wandering about, and it's incredibly beautiful. Met the volunteers in a sort of little side park. That's where we parked. We met the sort of soldiers from the various units that were collecting the kit that had been brought to them, and it was a really affecting scene. There were, I think, 2 or 3 different units that had come to collect stuff from the volunteers, and sort of rather one of the points of similarity, I think, between British and Ukrainian culture is an incredible sort of self-deprecation and a certain modesty. So you had Ukrainian soldiers saying, thank you very much for bringing this stuff, and the British volunteers saying, oh no, thank you for doing what you do, and the Ukrainian soldiers saying, no, thank you. So that was sort of slightly amusing to watch. And I spoke to a few of the soldiers. We didn't have much time there. We had to sort of get out and get the train. But it was very affecting. The brigade commander, was an incredibly formidable woman with tattoos all over her arms and on her neck as well. So I asked her, a little bit about what receiving this help from the UK. People had driven 1,500 miles more to bring the stuff to Ukraine. What it meant to them, and she welled up and found it difficult to answer. And I asked her as well, when do you think these things, these trucks, this medical aid, the drones, etc., when do you think this will get to the front line? And she said, later this afternoon. We're going straight back. So that was. I spoke to several of the other soldiers, and just to say, all of these interviews will be in the special podcasts we devote to this trip and to this journey. But to sum them up, I spoke to one woman, actually, sorry, she wasn't a soldier, she was a volunteer who'd been with the units and been sort of helping them with aid, helping them with any issues or problems they encountered. And one, it was interesting to hear that she'd sort of dropped, she was a new mother and had dropped everything at the outbreak of the full-scale invasion, and had just become a bit of a mother to the soldiers. She said that's how they referred to her, as their mother. And the British volunteers had actually brought leftover from a coronation lunch, the King's coronation lunch, several sort of small plastic Union flags, and they gave them to these Ukrainian soldiers and volunteers. And the volunteer I interviewed had been given 3. So I asked her, what will you do with these? Have you thought about where to put them? And she said, 1 she'll take home, she'll keep with her. 1 she'll give to her son so he can take it to school, so his classmates can see that Ukraine has friends and allies. And the final 1, she said she would take to her parents, but she can't do that yet because they live in occupied Melitopol. And at that, she welled up and turned away. The thought of her parents still living under Russian occupation was too much, and we ended it there. And and then after that, we moved out. Well, we shared some pizza and some delicious soup with these guys, and then had to get out because Kramatorsk is still fairly live, and also the train leaves on time in Ukraine, as Dom Nichols knows. So we went to the station and got on an air-conditioned, on-time train with enough seats for everybody that was cheap, which took about 7 to 8 hours to get back to Kyiv. And I really do think British Railways could learn something from that. It was quite astonishing to sort of, the train is full of soldiers either going on leave or going back for training, and it left on time. It was perfectly comfortable and a really smooth ride. Got back to Kyiv late last night. And gosh, what have we been doing since? I slept for about 10 hours because every night I've been working trying to get all these interviews sort of labelled correctly so we can come back to them and edit them together. This morning, met a contact for a sort of long breakfast, which was very interesting. And just doing more interviews, speaking to more people around Kyiv. So if you I don't know if you're wandering through Taras Shevchenko Park at the moment, do wave. I'm on the right near the fountain. But Francis, that gives you a sense, I think, of what we've been up to in the last few days. One thing maybe to say is driving across Ukraine and taking the train and so on, unless you've sort of done it, nothing prepares you just for the vast scale of the country. It's such a big country. Francis, you and I come from I would say a medium to small size country, but really, it takes 7 hours to get to Kramatorsk, which is about 40 minutes from Bakhmut, I say roughly. And it's very easy to think when you're walking around Kyiv, as I am now, in a beautiful sort of manicured garden with a fountain, with everything, that everything feels very far away. But that's of course not necessarily true. Everybody here will have been affected by the war in different ways, whether it's having friends going to fight and losing them, whether it's hearing the air alert and seeing and experiencing the missile strikes, whether it's dealing with foreigners coming in and offering aid. There's all sorts of ways, but it's that changes subtly and is really dependent on where you are, I think, quite a lot. But it is absolutely eye-opening, and seeing a beautiful city like Kharkiv and Kramatorsk and elsewhere, really, that we've been driving through, and seeing some of the damage that's been inflicted on it seeing the destroyed villages opens your eyes to just how destructive and utterly total what being on the receiving end of a barrage of Russian artillery that lasts for weeks or months actually looks like. And what it looks like is a village with no people, with no roofs, with no windows, which has been leveled to the ground and may never be inhabited again. That's what it looks like. That's the reality of it.
Well, thank you very much, David, and we'll come back to you at the end, as I say. Now, it's our privilege to be joined again on the podcast by James Cowan, former general in the British Army with experience in Iraq, Zimbabwe, Hong Kong, among many other places. He's also been CEO of the Halo Trust since 2015. That's a humanitarian non-government organisation which primarily works to clear landmines and other explosive devices left behind by conflicts. It has over 10,000 staff worldwide running operations in 28 countries and has destroyed over 1.5 million landmines and over 11 million pieces of large caliber ordnance since its foundation in 1988. Mr. Cohen, thank you very much for your time today. We were keen to bring you back to discuss the upcoming Ukraine Recovery Conference here in London that I talked about with Aliona Hlivko last week. But before we turn to that, can you update us on Halo's latest work in Ukraine, particularly in light of the movement of mines after the destruction of the dam?
So the Halo Trust, we've been in Ukraine actually since 2015. And because we've been there so long and preceding the February invasion, we have an unparalleled insight into the state of the country. And in fact, our headquarters was in Kramatorsk, which we've just heard about in the previous section of this podcast. And because we work across the country, we have a pretty good insight into what is taking place. Down in Kherson, I think it's extremely interesting. Water levels are receding around Mykolaiv, but whilst roads and bridges to the minefields are open again, most of the 7 minefields we were working on a tributary of the Dnipro, the inulets, are still partially flooded. And that's pretty concerning because we'd actually already cleared 480 anti-tank mines from around there, but now, of course, they're covered in mud and we can't do anything until the ground dries out further. Most of the houses near these minefields are flooded, and of course the crops are ruined. And of course, Ukraine is one of the world's great wheat producers, and the fact that so much agricultural land is not in productive use at the moment is both ruinous to the Ukrainian economy, but of course of deep concern globally. I also work in Somalia, where there is a famine now as a direct result of the Ukraine war. So this is the exact consequence, the direct consequence of what's taken place with the destruction of the dam. We're also seeing some other interesting technical things. There's a thing called the YAM sea mine. This is a small sea mine designed to be used in shallow waters, and the Russians have placed these on the banks of the Dnipro. But of course, once they flooded it, these mines floated off. They have a tilt switch, and the big explosions you're seeing in water is usually a YAM mine detonating because it's been shifted. It's an interesting and difficult technical aspect, which adds to the volume of normal conventional landmines, both anti-tank and anti-personnel, that we're seeing in the area.
Thank you very much. Well, I know that Dom will be wanting to ask some more about that in a moment. But before we turn to specifics on that, turning to this week, what are you hoping to hear at the Ukraine Reconstruction Conference? I spoke about it a little bit in the podcast last week for providing some context on this, but it's a big moment, and interested to hear your perspective on what you're expecting to see there.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate the British and Ukrainian governments. I mean, it's actually hosted by the Ukrainians, a bit like the Eurovision Song Contest, but of a rather more serious nature. But because it's taking place in London, I think the British government deserves a public congratulations for taking the initiative and allowing the Ukrainians to come. It's actually being billed as the Ukraine Recovery rather than Reconstruction Conference, and that implies a broader remit. But what do I want? Well, let's put it this way. This is a 1,000-kilometre front. To put that in comparative terms, the DMZ in Korea is only 128 kilometres long. This is the largest defensive belt constructed in Europe since the Second World War. It's akin really to the German defences from Normandy through to Denmark. And it's likely to contain somewhere in the region of 2 million landmines. Now, we've actually cleared 10,000 landmines in the last year, February to February. But really that's nothing by comparison with the 2 million that we assess, and we don't know for sure, that is in the Russian defense belt. So assuming that the Ukrainians are successful, and of course that is a big assumption, we need to scale up. We believe, and we've done this planning in conjunction with the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister and her staff at the Ministry of the Economy. We need to think in terms of the largest landmine clearance operation ever conducted. We're talking about 1,000 kilometers, 10,000 deminers, and billions of dollars needed to conduct this work. And so what we want from the conference this week is to essentially mobilize donors who can see the value of this, both from the private sector and from governments, to help us with this vital humanitarian work.
Just on the numbers there, I saw that the US ambassador to Ukraine, Bridget Brink, has said that the full-scale invasion has contaminated, her words, 30% of Ukraine with landmines and explosive hazards. I mean, is that the kind of rough order of magnitude figure you're working from? And just regardless of the figure, how do you go about prioritizing your work?
Dom, that's absolutely the vital question. So that sort of figure is correct. The Ukrainians themselves have issued a press statement saying that they are planning to return 470,000 hectares of the most valuable agricultural land to productive use within 4 years. So how do we go about planning this? Well, the first thing to do, as every ex-military person on this call will know, is that time spent in reconnaissance is seldom wasted. And we invest a great deal of time in survey, because you can waste a lot of money clearing landmines from places that don't have them. If you can do that survey well and as tightly as you can narrow down the area of contamination very significantly. And also, having decided there is no contamination, you can cancel it from the landmine database, and then you can allow farmers safely to get back to work on that land, or people to reoccupy homes. So survey is at the heart of this. And secondly, we're working with several very almost visionary, I think, private donors who are investing in the mechanization of our work. Landmine clearance is famous, Princess Diana, whatever, for people on their hands and knees working bravely in minefields, but in slow and painstaking ways. We want to mechanize this. We are investing heavily in plant, and we need a fleet of several hundred mechanical assets to conduct this clearance work. And that will allow us to get agricultural land back into use as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I mean, is there a role for AI in this? We hear that that's going to take over the world and kill us all. But before that, are there any opportunities for AI to go sort of auto mine searching, surveying, and so on? Is there anything at all there?
Well, AI is interpretive. It is essentially there to look at databases and make sensible decisions about the scale and density of contamination. And of course, it's going to be extremely helpful for us. But ultimately, you need to do survey, and that survey can be done from space. For instance, we're not just clearing landmines, we're clearing artillery ammunition, and a big part is tracking fires using the same technology that is used in North America to track summer fires there. You can use the same to see fields that are aflame and see where artillery strikes have taken place. But we're also using change data to identify how land is looking, and then from satellite imagery, open source satellite imagery, we're able to get the bigger picture. But once you have that bigger picture, you then need to conduct detailed survey. We talk to communities, and of course, one of the problems with talking to communities is that if those communities have fled and whole areas are depopulated, you don't have access to that human intelligence to give you knowledge of where the landmines are. So ultimately, you have to use technical survey where we use mine detectors, which can be quite large-scale mine detectors or mounted on drones to assess the actual perimeter of any given minefield.
Thanks. Now, looking at the Ukraine Recovery Conference itself, I just wonder who's going to be doing the coordination of that. I think you may well say it comes from the Ukrainian Ministry of the Economy, and I'm guessing your work is somewhat standalone, or do you have a requirement to coordinate with other agencies to any degree? And if so, how will that work?
Well, the conference is being coordinated by the British government, the Foreign Office, and various other Whitehall departments, and the Ukrainians themselves. So that's the sort of core of how the conference works. We are working with the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister. She has responsibility for this. That's Yulia Sorodenko. And we are holding joint meetings with her. And at one event that we'll be hosting, I'll be on the panel with her, and we'll have some 200 people in the audience. The aim is to talk to the agricultural sector, to the banking sector, to all the various private sectors that might seek to invest in Ukraine, to seek their support for our work. And we already have quite a large number of private donors in the corporate space who are helping to fund our work. So we want to reach more of those during the course of the week. We're also obviously talking to the various governments that are present, and the Halo Trust is very lucky to be funded very generously by the United States, by Germany, by Britain, by the Netherlands, by all major European countries, Canada, Japan, etc. So those people are also in London this week, and we'll be talking to them too.
Brilliant, thank you. And Halo Trust has a very difficult task at the best of times. But when we've chatted before, you've explained to me how you also have, on many occasions, have to find a way to communicate, certainly interact, maybe even coordinate with the former warring parties, including, as you do with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Have you so far had any dealings with Russian forces? And can anything happen in an ongoing conflict, even well away from the fighting, to start that communication? How do you go about initiating such contact?
Well, the fundamental duty of a humanitarian NGO such as the Halo Trust is to be there for all beneficiaries, irrespective of which side they're on, because innocent civilians, whether they be on the Ukrainian or Russian side of the line of control, are the people who are suffering as a result of this landmine contamination. Years after the soldiers have left, there will still be civilians, women, children, men, who are being killed or being wounded by landmines, which will remain in the ground and will not cease to be dangerous until they are cleared, because they are essentially hermetically sealed pieces of plastic. So it's important that we can work on both sides of the line of control. But ultimately, the chance for us to work there is dependent upon the de facto authorities allowing us so to do. And if they're not willing to let us, then of course we can't force our presence upon people who don't want us there. So we work to persuade, and if the Russians did want us there, we would be there. But at the moment, that isn't the case. And so we only work on the Ukrainian side of the line of control.
Just one final one, if I may, if I could abuse our position of inviting you on today and ask you to remind and update us on Waterloo Uncovered. I was there over the weekend for my 30-year Sandhurst reunion, the battlefield of Waterloo. But the work you've done with Waterloo Uncovered, if you could just sort of remind us what that is. And if you're able to offer a view on why such work is so helpful for veterans and others who suffer physically and mentally as a result of military service or their experience.
Yeah, it's a very off topic and probably very unexpected for other listeners. So Waterloo Uncovered is a little charity that does quite an unusual thing. It was founded by some archaeologists, some enthusiasts from university who happened to join the army. And they thought, wouldn't it be amazing if we could put our enthusiasm for archaeology to good use in the support of veteran servicemen and women who've suffered from the effects of recent conflicts. So they've focused it on the battlefield of Waterloo, and every summer they go out to Waterloo and there is an archaeological dig. It's most recently been around the Chateau of Hougoumont and other key features of the battlefield. And these ex-servicemen and women come and take part, and it's amazingly therapeutic to spend a few weeks in the summer sun in Belgium, exploring a war of 2 centuries ago, but in really very peaceful circumstances. They find it incredibly therapeutic. They also learn a lot, and there's a great deal of scholarship that has come out of the Waterloo Uncovered endeavour. It's an amazing little charity, and it does an amazing amount for very little money for some servicemen and women who desperately need it. So I strongly recommend it to all listeners. I'm actually a trustee of the charity. I wasn't expecting this question, but Dom, thank you for giving me the chance to explain the work of Waterloo Uncovered.
There's talks about Russian money that's been held by countries due to sanctions and the sort, or indeed reparations after the war, going on the sort of projects that you work on. Has there been any hint? Have you received any information that would suggest that there will be money of Russia that's been held as a consequence of the sanction program that will go to programs like yours or others?
Well, Russian money really falls in two categories. The first is Russian state money, and there is quite a large amount of Russian money that is held in abroad in Western capitals, and there are precedents for its use. The Afghan state reserves were appropriated by the Americans, and a law passed which gave half those state reserves to the victims of 9/11. The Canadians have passed a law. The Swiss, I think, have passed a law making it possible to appropriate liquid assets from the state. But there is also private money. And of course, the most notable example is the sale of Chelsea Football Club and the fact that £2.3 billion of that sale are held in a current account. That money is still in that current account, has not yet been dispersed. It's not for me to say what the cause of that problem is, but as someone who runs a charity that could make extremely good use of some of that money to help the poor people of Ukraine, I would strongly encourage resolution to that problem as soon as possible.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Cowan, for your time. Just one final question from me, if I may, which is, since we're on the subject of history, it's well known, of course, that in Belgium and in France, to this day, there is the so-called iron harvest of shells and munitions left over from the First World War, which are churned up by farming, left at the side of the fields and are collected by the government. And to this day, if anybody is injured by those, they receive, I think, a pension that equates to what the pension was at the end of the First World War. I need to look that up exactly, but it's still very much part of the living experience, the living suffering a century on from the First World War. I just wanted to ask, how confident are you that with the technology we've developed now, that we won't a century from now still be finding a ton of munitions every year left over in Ukraine from this war, that we can actually clear it in a fairly short amount of time once the war is over? Do you think that's a pipe dream, or do you think that's actually a reality now?
Thanks, Francis. It's such an important question. So essentially, the reason why all that ammunition is still being found is the intensity of the fighting in the First World War. And I think some of us are aware that the fighting around Bakhmut is at a similar intensity to the battles of Verdun and of the Somme or of Ypres. And it's quite possible, therefore, given the fact that it's not a formal minefield, it's just a very, very churned up piece of ground, that some of that ordnance may emerge in a very long time. However, the Halo Trust's work, we've been doing this work now for 35 years. We've actually managed to clear the whole of Mozambique. It took us 20 years to do, 200,000 landmines removed. It is actually possible to make a country free of landmines because the fighting there was less intense than in Ukraine. Ultimately, we work on a very rough rule of thumb, which is 1 day's fighting equals 1 month of clearance. And you can see immediately how long this is going to take. But it's only possible, there's a very misleading rule of thumb if the money isn't actually applied to allow us to do this work. We need to raise money to make this possible. And we need to find that money not only from governments, but from the many generous donors who fund our work. And so if we don't raise that money, those landmines will remain in the ground for an indefinite period of time.
Well, thank you very much. That's really interesting. I'll come back to you in a moment, if I may, for your final thought. But before I do, I just want to whiz through a few updates in Russia over the weekend very briefly. So these are that the jailed Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny's new trial began today on charges of extremism that could keep him in prison for decades. It's taking place in the penal colony where he's being held about 250 kilometers east of Moscow. He's already serving a 9-year sentence, of course, for parole violation. elections fraud and contempt of court, but his supporters insist his arrest and imprisonment in 2021 was politically motivated, and we've covered that at length in the past. Mr. Navalny is now facing multiple charges, including creating an extremist network and financing extremist activity, something that could extend his prison term by up to 30 years. It comes off the back of an anti-war activist dying in a Russian prison last week after being tortured. That's according to a human rights group. Rostov police have insisted that Anatoly Berezikov, 40, died by suicide following his arrest on suspicion of treason for putting up posters that called for the Russian army to leave Ukraine. However, First Department, that's the human rights NGO he worked for, said that he died the day before he was due to be released after being taken to a forest and wounded with a stun gun. A lawyer for the group has said that the alleged treatment of the activist, a supporter of Navalny, it has to be said, fitted a wider pattern of an attempt to crack down on dissent. Now, the other story I wanted to touch on is a collection of recent reports of stress within the Russian armed forces and the political apparatus, a theme actually we've talked about today in a slightly different context. So a doctor in Russia's Rostov region has said Russian soldiers traumatized by war are numbing themselves with alcohol and drugs, saying that Russia has completely failed to set up long-term treatment services for soldiers with post-traumatic stress disorder, which has left them vulnerable to alcohol misuse. Apparently, officials raised fears of a spike in drug addiction and the social consequences as soldiers started to return home. Cases of addiction to numerous substances such as methadone are reportedly rising, according to the Russian government. And it sort of tallies with a story in the Telegraph over the weekend written by our very own James Kilner that the Kremlin has also doubled extraordinarily its wine allowance for Russian officials. Didn't know there even was an allowance in the first place. That's pretty amazing in itself, to alleviate the stress of Ukraine's counteroffensive. So sources have told the Verska News website that Russian government officials have taken to drinking cognac throughout the day and turning up in some cases to meetings drunk and morose. They quote one of the sources as saying, "Not everyone used to start their day with a glass of vodka, but now I know many more people that do. For some, a glass has turned into a bottle." Apparently, there's been a particular increase in drinking among government officials since March, when Ukraine began talking up its planned offensives and Putin was placed on the International Criminal Court's wanted list. A small story, perhaps, but there have been similar reports floating around for recent weeks, as I say, that do suggest pressure within the organs of the state are on the rise. I'm sure pressure is immense in Ukraine, of course, as well. And if we see signs of that, we will report it. But what's interesting about this in the Russian context is the timing. As I say, we're only at the start of the offensive. Yet if these stories are true, then it's going to be a long few months for those already stretched to breaking. And it's in these contexts, of course, that mistakes are often made. But now it's time for our final thoughts. David, if I could come to you first, then Dom, before Mr. Cowan for the final word. David Knowles.
Thanks, Francis. So there's a square, not so much a square. There's a place in Kyiv just opposite or next to St. Michael's Church, at the other end of the long street, and you've got St. Sophia's on one side, and then you go down, and then at the other end there's St. Michael's. And in front of that is the area where the Ukrainians put captured Russian armour. So I went there last year. You'll see it quite a lot. You know, lots of world leaders go there. There's a collection of tanks, APCs, a self-propelled howitzer, and I went there on Friday with my friend, and the collection, what's displayed, has changed somewhat. There's more things. St. Michael's lit up, illuminated, so they've got the golden domes of the church shining over the city. You've got the statue of Olho of Kiev on the side, with, I believe, on the one side of her is Yaroslav, and the other side I can't quite remember. They're all uncovered. The sandbags protecting these monuments have been taken down. They're lit up as well. If you look back up the street, you'll see St. Sophia's also lit up. And then you look around again in this sort of strange graveyard, and not a single one of the Russian armoured vehicles, tanks, missile systems has any lights on it. See, they look like sort of, well, slightly like ghosts. We were peering into one APC, and the attached sort of description said that it had been captured and it was set on fire. And you almost can't see anything. These things are dark. They absorb light. They don't reflect it. They're sort of rusting and dark. I thought I don't know whether it was intended or not by the authorities, but the contrast of seeing the sort of the jewels of the crown of the centre of Kyiv, the cultural jewels of the city, so St. Michael's, St. Sophia's, and some of the statues lit up. And then the ghosts of the machines and the armour that come to take all that away, that come to destroy it, left in darkness. Silent ghosts. It was quite something. If you do come to Kyiv, it's rather easy to get to. And in the day, it's an odd experience because some people are walking around looking very grave. And you've also got kids sort of swinging off the barrel and climbing all over these tanks and so on. And at night, it's a completely different experience. It's very silent. And yeah, I'm not sure how much of a final thought that is, but it struck me that the things that were illuminated, the things that should be illuminated were, and the things that should be left and should be shunned were exactly that.
Well, thank you very much, David. Dominic Nichols, for your final thought.
Well, I've also been in a bit of a reflective move over the weekend. As I said, I visited the battlefield of Waterloo, and I was reminded that Wellington, the Duke of Wellington there, said that it was a damn near run thing. There are no guarantees in warfare, and as we watch this counter-offensive, which is still very, very early days, I think it's fair to ask again what the purpose is of it. Is it to win the war? Is it to show massive, significant advances across all fronts? I don't think either of those things are the purpose of this offensive. I think it's still much more to show Ukraine has the ability to conduct combined arms warfare with the major counteroffensive much later this year, or possibly even next. I see the US election at the back end of next year as the big line in the calendar. But regardless, even as Ukraine is making these small advances, it is coming at a huge cost. And I just want to end, but it's worth remembering Wellington's quote after the Battle of Waterloo, when he said, "Believe me, nothing except a battle lost can be half so melancholy as a battle won. The bravery of my troops hitherto saved me from the greater evil, but to win such a battle as this of Waterloo at the expense of so many gallant friends could only be termed a heavy misfortune but for the result to the public." And I think it's worth reflecting on that.
Thank you very much, Dom. Mr. Cowan, your very final thoughts for today.
Thanks, Francis. Well, I used to be a soldier. I was a Major General, and I think I understand the military aspects of this. And I think a year and a bit ago, I think most of us would have assumed that the Russian military would have put in a more impressive performance than they have. And in almost every respect, the Russians appear to have failed as an army. But in one important regard, they have, I think, had a success, and that is their engineering arm. The engineering branch of the Russian army has perhaps sustained its reputation, and the scale of Russian defences are impressive. And I think there is a danger in being lulled into the false belief that victory will always come easily to Ukraine. This is not going to be an easy victory. These defensive positions, which are to a very large degree supported by landmine laying, are going to be extremely difficult to breach, and Western vehicles are just as vulnerable to landmines as Russian vehicles. So I think we need to be serious about the scale of this landmine contamination. It's going to take a huge amount to clear it up and to return Ukraine to the peaceful condition it enjoyed before this war.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Giles Gear, with executive producers David Knowles and Louisa Wells.